Okay, I think we're live. Verify we pop up on the YouTube. Well, there we are. Don't echo. Okay, awesome. All right, I'm so excited to have Jake here from Pokenomics, which is his YouTube channel. And Jake is a Pokemon collectibles YouTuber who has been super educational, I would say, like in the hobby of collecting and investing and kind of speculating on Pokemon cards. But especially coming out of this recent 2020 boom that we had, 2020, 2021. And Jake's channel has been super informative and educational for me, really helpful. And so I figured we would talk a bit about why Pokemon is kind of I don't like the word investable, but that's definitely what it's become, and why people speculate on Pokemon, what makes these cards kind of have value and become worth thousands of dollars, and at the same time, hopefully, it can serve as a bit of an introduction to the hobby, and we can kind of go through the bit of a history and the different eras of Pokemon, because it's now 25 years old, and it's a hobby that has potentially a long history ahead of it as well. So, Jake, thanks for being here. Really glad to have you. And so the first thing I kind of want to ask is, you're really great because you are not focused purely on Pokemon, and you kind of understand TCGs and other collectibles and stuff, and so and the history of it going back, before the 20th century even. So I wanted to ask you, what makes collectibles valuable, and what sets or what's unique about Pokemon? Because I think we would both agree that there's something kind of unique about Pokemon, or maybe there isn't. Maybe it behaves like every other collectible. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So what makes a collectible have value?
Yeah.
Is your question. So yeah, so I guess I would start, big question, but I would start with thinking about what when we think about, or we try to compare something like food or water or shelter, or things that like take care of our physiological needs and have maybe more of a obvious direct value in terms of keeping us alive, or collectibles are not like that. Collectibles, the value comes from enjoying them, the dopamine rush of hunting, of completing collections, of the nostalgia of getting something that reminds you of your childhood or reminds you of a different time in your life, um, or you really appreciate and enjoy the story, the lore, the world building that goes behind an intellectual property, an IP like Pokemon or Marvel or Star Wars, and it's something that you really enjoy, and so you like to collect things that remind you of your enjoyment of that. And then there's so that's where I would say the first value comes from, is sort of the appreciation of the story, the history, the IP, the world. And then it can also be appreciating or enjoying the specific art, the aesthetic beauty, the aesthetic quality. You can appreciate the history of something. You can appreciate the rarity of something, how hard it is to get, how hard it is to find, how few people have it is something that could bring value to someone, because that's exciting or interesting to them. I think the way that these things can bring value, but then get into sort of a bubble, or maybe be problematic, or you can see that value implode very quickly, is when most of the value is just about trying to make money off of it and hoping that it will continue to go up, or thinking like the excitement or the value of owning this item is that in 3 years, I think it'll triple or quadruple in value. And I think that that's driven a lot of the hobbies that exploded in the pandemic, and including crypto. But it's, it's hard to tease out sort of what is sort of the underlying kind of fundamental value that's unchanging, and what is more driven by the excitement or the hope that I'm going to be able to make money and change my life through owning this thing, or through being able to flip or buy and sell this thing. And I don't really think you can completely tease those things apart, but you have sort of an extreme example of like the tulip bubble, the famous like tulip bubble mania, which, for those who don't know in your audience, like, the story being that at one point in human history, without going too much in depth, tulips, people were paying a full year's wage for tulips, basically, even though these were things that could be grown and seemingly infinite, potentially like fairly infinite supply. And yet somehow people, despite the fact that it wasn't that expensive to grow it and it wasn't that difficult to get. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because some variations were a lot more expensive and harder to get, and it was a new thing that they didn't realize, it was going to be as easy to get, and that they're, blah, 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 blah. But the point being that it became sort of this collectible item that became very desirable by society for a short period of time, and that people spent years worth of salary on it because it made them feel excited, or they thought they were going to make more money off of it, or it was a social status thing. You needed one to be part of social status. So those are always the things, the warning signs or whatever, when you're a speculator or investor, you're looking for in collectible spaces. How strong do you feel like the actual IP is? How strong do you feel like the thing has value outside of just the pleasure or enjoyment that you might get from it, and how much is just sort of being driven by the trying to get rich quick, or wanting to be included, or the sort of the social acceptance. And it can take, bubbles and those types of things can take many, many years to form, and can take many, many years to disappear, or they can happen really quick. So, it can be like something can explode, and then it can, disappear just as quickly, or it can take like 20 years for it to like build up, and then 20 years for it to like deflate. And pop culture collectibles in particular are, largely at risk for this type of thing, because they don't necessarily remain popular, and although Pokemon or Star Wars or Marvel or some of the biggest IPs in the world are very popular now, it doesn't mean that they'll be popular in 20 years. So, when you say Pokemon has something special to it, I think that the size of the company, the connections it has, the multi-generational, the fact that like kids today are loving it, 20-year-olds are loving it, 30-year-olds are loving it, and we're, moving into like 3 different generations easily collecting it. It's a very strong hobby right now, but it fundamentally is no different than anything that came before it. It's more just a difference in degree, not in kind, I would say, and could run the same risks of people losing interest and kind of moving on to a different IP, or different collectible, moving on from cards to wanting plushes or video games or whatever.
Right.
That's what I was.
Yeah, and I think the like category of IP is like a recent one, right? Because if you think about something that is collectible, like stamps or coins, things like that. I think for those things, and correct me if I'm wrong, things like scarcity and condition and that sort of stuff are sort of paramount. Whereas with Pokemon, it's really about, like brand loyalty almost, right? Because it's like people don't just collect every TCG. They pick the one that, they have an attachment to, or the game that they play, and all that. And also, yeah, even the idea of the fact that these were trading card games. In the past, they were bartered, right? It wasn't like, my Squirtle has a $1 price tag. It was like, my Squirtle is worth your 3 Weedles, or something. And over time, that's developed like into this market where the actual like dollar conversion to the card is like the most common thing, right? Whereas like before, it was trading the cards on the schoolyard. And it's really interesting to see how that's developed. And I think, the idea that Pokemon will lose relevance and all that is like probably the biggest threat, right, to being into this hobby. Although I imagine you and I would both probably, if everything in Pokemon went to zero, we'd be the ones opening boxes still. But the idea of the IP losing relevance is, I think, really important. And also, well, so that what's crazy about it is that it's so nebulous, right? Because, for example, like my other favorite TCG outside of Pokemon is Berserk. And you're familiar with Berserk?
Mm-mm.
So Berserk is a manga series that is, started in the 80s, and it's really influential, widely considered. Like if you go to like the manga site, it'll be the number one. Like in Japanese manga, Berserk is king, and rightfully so. And they made a TCG for it, I want to say in the 90s, and it's had like a couple TV show adaptations, a couple movie adaptations. And the TCG is expensive because it's rare, but it's definitely not like, it doesn't even have its own category on like TCG Player or something. Very small niche. So it's essentially a dead TCG that has value just because there's so little of it that the people that are really into it are kind of carrying the value. But like, does that mean that if I get an unopened booster box of Berserk, that 10 years from now, it's really going to like go up in value like a Pokemon booster box or something? It's a bit nebulous, even though there's going to be probably even more fans of Berserk in the future than there are today. You know what I mean? It's the type of thing that could continue to grow and yet not like see an equivalent, increase in value. And I think you see with that with a lot of things. Like, so yeah, so Pokemon I mean, the collectible cards are weird like that, and it's really interesting. But in Pokemon, you do see this like crazy speculation that's happened in the last couple of years, and I think that's what has kind of made it both like fun and a bit weird to get into. Like I remember, so I lived in New York, and I used to just carry the cards with me out there because I just liked them so much. And I had them all in like my childhood binders and stuff. And I remember one time, maybe this was like 2015 or so, trying to sell, or like going on Reddit and just asking like, how much would anyone um, buy my first edition Dark Ampharos from Neo Destiny? And I think the highest offer I got was like $17. And I was like, that doesn't, like, no way I'm going to give this card up for that. And then here we are now, and like the card is, probably like a $140, $150 type card. So yeah, really interesting. It goes up, it goes down. And I just wanted to kind of set the scene for like what the Pokemon boom has been. So I know you've talked about this a lot, but I'm curious, like, where do you think we are in that boom? Do you think we're heading towards like a down period? Are we, are we at a top? Are we getting to a bottom? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. A couple things. So first I would say is that I think it's really important to just everything is supply and demand. All markets are supply and demand. And so, when we think about just to touch on a few points you were talking about, when we think about um ideas of rarity versus and then scarcity, sort of the amount that's available in the market versus like the amount of interest for that item versus sort of like where does it need to have an intellectual property to be valuable, these types of lots of discussions can be had on all those things. But I guess to go to your I guess I'll we can loop back into that, but just to answer your question now, if I were forced to guess, and I don't think it's worth that much, because I think that when you're in it, it's really very, very, unless it's very obvious, like unless you're, I think, very towards a top or maybe very towards a bottom, and it's like, I think that it's very difficult to know where you're at in any sort of cycle. Um,
Yeah.
if I were forced to guess, I would say that we are still in a broader boom of collectibles, um, of most markets, honestly, and that there's a lot of interest right now in investing and in collectibles, and we are not in a period where it's sort of like a very undervalued, dead hobby
Hmm.
that could potentially explode in the future. That's not what's happening. We're prices right now are quite um, uh, I think fairly expensive for how young the hobby is and for how much money is in the hobby. So I, I think that, when, I mean, how many, there just are not, first of all, there are very, very few people who are above the age of 35 who know anything about Pokemon or have any connection or engagement to Pokemon, or let's say
Hmm.
maybe above the age of 40, if we want to be, generous. There's some because they collected maybe with their kids during the mania in like 1999. Very few, and because of that, most people kind of in their 30s, 35, do not have huge incomes or don't have huge savings where they can put hundreds of thousands of dollars annually into something like Pokemon.
Right.
And yet, there are lots of cards that are there are a few cards that are over $1 million, and there are lots of cards that are over $10,000, many, many cards, and it's like, where's all this money coming from? And if I were forced to be if I was pushed to say, I would say that there's still probably quite a bit of leveraged people. There's quite a bit of people who probably have 80% of their net worth, 90% of their net worth or something, 70% in cards in Pokemon, and aren't making huge salaries and are even borrowing more money to buy more Pokemon or try to flip and speculate. And I think this is true for it's not a Pokemon specific thing. It's actually true for pretty much every investment category right now,
Yeah.
in my view, but particularly the more speculative categories and the categories that like lean younger. Um,
Do you
in
think that younger people feel like collectibles or I believe they're called like alternative assets, right? As a category. You think younger people feel that alternative assets are like a safer place to park money than like securities?
I don't I hope they don't feel safer. Like, I there's I that would make me nervous exactly why people would think that it would be safer. I mean, there's some things that,
Well,
I mean,
I
you
guess
can
let's
make
say for
some
like a
case
short term period, you know.
I mean, you could certainly make some case for diversification across a number of different asset classes, including collectibles, and including crypto, including stocks, including real estate, and reasons why I should have some exposure to all of these things. But I think when you're in anything that does not have a long track record and is highly volatile and is very emotional, like very emotion driven. Now, all markets are extremely emotion driven, including the stock market. Real estate, a little bit less, a little slower moving. Very easy to press a button on in the stock market, very easy to press a button and sell everything or move everything. In crypto, a little bit harder. In Pokemon, a little bit harder. In the liquid items, a little bit harder. In real estate, markets tend to lag a little bit, move a little bit slower. Those types of things. Yeah, but I mean, my personal opinion is that there's both a lot more demand and interest and engagement, but there's also a lot more things are much more expensive across the board, and I do think that I don't look at these hobbies and say like these things are very cheap and people who are in these hobbies can easily afford this, and why isn't it more expensive? And that's sort of how I felt a few years ago, before, where I was feeling, when cards that are now $1,000 were $50 and there were only 30 of these $50 cards in the world. It was sort of like, it's interesting that there's only 30 people who are willing to spend, markets don't actually work like this, but just, bear with me, that there are only 30 people willing to spend $50 in the world who don't have this card. And it's actually a lot less, because there'd only be like 2 or 3 of those cards on the market. But they weren't selling at those prices. And then all of a sudden, everything exploded. So it's just very interesting how rapidly those things change. And then when those things change, does that keep going? Does that keep going up? Does that sort of excitement and engagement and demand just bring in more people and more interest and engagement and demand, which then pushes things higher? Or does it create a little bit of a bubble effect? I'm not sure. I think that there are positive factors right now in the market, and there are some negative risk factors. And overall, what I say, because I'm fundamentally a collector, and I just, and I enjoy sort of the investment speculation attitude, but I enjoy owning these items and having these items. And I, like, even if I were to lose a lot of money, I would still be engaging, because I'm willing to, because it has value to me, because I enjoy it, and it's not fundamentally just about making a profit. But I would definitely preach caution, and I would preach really being able to afford what you're doing. And if you're viewing this stuff as like an investment, to be diversified in a number of different asset classes that ideally are also producing some cash flow, and you have a decent job that's paying you a decent salary, so you're getting monthly cash flow from that, and you're not dependent on these like liquid assets that don't pay dividend, that don't pay any yield, and that don't produce anything, and that are highly volatile. There's a lot of negatives to this stuff, as much as I freaking love them. Now, I love this stuff, and I'm a huge, like, if that doesn't scare you away and you still really enjoy this stuff and you want to do it, then you should.
Yeah.
But anyone who's like, I'm doing this to get rich fundamentally, and doesn't have like a huge passion for it, it doesn't make any sense. Now, the one upside I will say is that if you are very educated and engaged, I think can be quite difficult to lose money because there's a lot of, like, for lack of better, like, there's a lot of arbitrage opportunity, which doesn't exist necessarily in markets that are very optimized, like the stock market, for example.
Right.
And that arbitrage opportunity exists because, like, literally you can buy things at 40%, 50, 60%, and then the next week sell it at 100%, and make that, and constantly make that profit while you're also trying to speculate and invest. Not sure if I'm still.
Yeah, I got you. I got you now.
I don't know if I froze or if you froze or what exactly.
Might have been. You were saying that there are arbitrage opportunities.
Yeah, and I think if you mix in those arbitrage opportunities with keeping the stuff that's sort of rarer, that you feel like is more undervalued, and you're really doing that over a long period of time and learning, I do think it will be difficult to lose a lot of money, particularly if you're also constantly taking some of that money out of the hobby and putting it in and diversifying it into other stuff. I think that's a scenario where even if the hobby is quite a bit smaller in many years from now, you overall you still probably would have made money or not lost considerable money. I think
Right.
the way
And
you
yeah,
lose
so
money is making huge, leveraging yourself on credit cards, going to PwC, and I know people like going to PwCC Vault. I just heard a
mm,
story recently of like a 17-year-old kid who went on to PwCC Vault and got $50,000 loan on the cards that he has in their vault to immediately spend that on another card. All money he doesn't have
wow.
that's built on just on these cards, right? And now he owes
Yeah,
like
that's
1%
crazy.
a month. So it's just like, it's like that is how you can get absolutely destroyed.
I
But
mean,
as long as
that is really crazy that people do that. I mean,
yeah.
I know you've really you've been like a voice of caution, but yeah, I mean, I guess it's just hard for me to even understand that, like why people would do such a thing. But I guess people make people
I
do that sort of thing all the time with like predatory, loans of all kinds.
I mean, it might work out extremely well, and I don't think like a 1%. I mean, a 1% a month is 12% a year, which is going to be, less than most credit cards, but it's in, and, is not, honestly, for PWCC is not risk free, because
Mm,
at the end of the day, they could get completely screwed. Like, I don't even think that's a bad loan or a bad deal from them for PWCC, because let's say the sports market, in this case, it's sports, the sports card market crashes, and now the person can't pay it back. And then the
mm,
only collateral they have is the cards. And so PWCC keeps the cards, but the cards have gone down 80% in value. So
right.
PWCC is actually screwed and has now
Yeah.
lost $60,000 basically, and is only making 12% a year. It's not a risk-free investment from them to loan that money. It's probably fair. So I don't think it's like predatory or anything from them, but I think it's very it's very foolish, and very risky of a person. Now, if you have a bunch of assets that if things went bad, you'd be able to easily pay it off, and you're managing a lot of different things. And, there are ways you can certainly borrow money and leverage money. I mean, most people who make a lot of money and are constantly borrowing money and leveraging money and trying to get,
Right.
free money, as they say, like 3-4%, in whatever
Right.
they're engaging in, particularly something like real estate. But, when you're getting, at 12, 13, 15, 20%, you better be, whatever you're investing that money in, better be freaking amazing, because you're paying quite a hefty sum to be able to do that. So
Yeah. Well, and so to kind of maybe elucidate on some points that you made, I feel like one, I always have felt like for one, I don't have so much disposable income. Probably spent more than I ought to on Pokemon boxes, but I almost always open them eventually, mainly because I'm trying to grow my collection. So something that I think of as like an investment is really for me just a way to grow the collection in the future. I'd rather stay within the Pokemon economy, trading cards up and trading product up than cashing out and leaving the Pokemon economy, right?
hmm.
I think that's kind of the way to go and the way to build collection over the long term rather than like constantly putting cash flow into the hobby. You know what I mean? And taking it out at some point, because then at that point um, you are you're at risk. You're at the whim of where the hobby is at that particular time. If you need cash flow, then you end up in a sticky situation where you have to get rid of something that you don't want. And another thing I think that really adds just some context to what you're saying that's so important is that I people should understand, if they don't, that Pokemon is such a huge hobby with so many different areas that you could conceivably find the thing that you like the most and focus on that while continuing to collect high value items uh, that are all over the place. And at the end of the day, it's like it comes down to what do I want to keep? What do I want to, use to keep growing what I want to keep, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's really important because like there's a ton of items in the hobby that are super valuable, or let's say have a high price tag that I'm not like necessarily interested in keeping. I'd rather like you know for example, one day, see, I'm still like a 3-figure collector, right? Um, so I'm still trying to acquire cards in the $100 plus range. That's the cards I'm most interested in, right? One day I'll go into the 4 figures, 5 figures, and so on. But if I suddenly acquired a $1,500 card, I'd rather use that to get like 10, 15 reverse hollows from a legendary collection or something. You know what I mean? So that's just where I'm at today. And another thing I think, just to elucidate for anybody who doesn't know, um, that makes the conversation about where we are in the hobby so interesting is that there are cards that come out today, like the latest set, the most desirable chase card from like the latest set will debut and stay, above $100, $150, $200, something like the Giratina from Lost Origin or something. That's like a $200 card, and for $200 you could get, probably like a pretty decent couple of decent collection, decent condition, Watsy hollows, all kinds of stuff. So it's like there's this weird kind of thing where the oldest cards, which I guess, yeah, like depending on condition, are some of the rarest cards, and you would imagine to hold the most value over time, are getting outpaced by these brand new cards that are, they're brand new and everybody's keeping them in good condition and stuff. So it's like this weird thing, and like it's hard to know if it means anything, because like the new cards, people obviously like them a lot. I happen to really like them a lot. Um, so yeah, anyways, just to add some context to all of that, like the hobby's huge. There's one thing I kind of wanted to actually touch on. You were saying that Pokemon is a very young hobby, and I'm curious if you can speak more on that, because to my knowledge, Magic is like the first modern TCG, right? And Magic is like what, maybe like 5, 6 years older than Pokemon.
Mhm.
So uh, do you also think Magic is a young hobby, and like where do you see like maturation happening for a hobby? Is it a time thing? Is there certain
And
factors you look for?
when I say young, I really just mean like the people in it are young. Like we're all young, like
Yeah,
relative to old to and younger people just don't have as much money
right.
on average. So Magic, there's older people with a little bit more money. Sports cards, books, coins, um, furniture, guns, swords, like items that have people who are in their 60s and 70s, and comic books, who have a lot more disposable income. Uh, um, there's a lot more of those people in those markets, so there's just a lot more money in those markets, or there's a lot more potential. So everything
Right.
is men at the end of the day, and the demand piece is dependent on not just do I want it, but do I have money?
Yeah,
um,
that's so important. I feel like that is really an amazing thing about Pokemon. I mean, we saw this like crazy boom in like the last 5 years, just as people were like reaching their, like right, like starting to have an income and stuff. Like I'm 28. Uh, 5, 6 years from now, like, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's such a huge thing. Like we've already seen such growth in this hobby, despite it being so young. And yeah, that really does kind of bode well, right? It's like optimistic.
It's optimistic, but there's also a danger that we're getting ahead of our skis a little bit here, and that prices are, a little bit, dangerous. And for the moment, but I think in the long run, if the interest, and just as you said, your goal is to spend, you want to spend thousands, you just don't feel comfortable spending thousands. But if you had more money, you'd feel comfortable spending thousands, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think, right, it's all relative, right? It's like, well, if I'm making 200,000 a year, spend, and to your point that you were saying before too, about how you want to maybe make money within the hobby and then put that money back into the hobby. And I think that that's a good goal. It's also like the only way to do it if you're not making enough money way overpaying your bills in
Yeah.
a smart way, right? So, but if I'm making, let's just say, if you're making, or someone's making $500,000 a year, or $250,000 a year, and they want to put $30,000 a year into Pokemon because they really like it and they're really engaged in the market and they understand the market, all the power to them. I would say, and that they should have plenty of money to put into stocks and real estate and pay their bill, depending on their lifestyle, obviously. But someone who's making $50,000-$60,000 a year might need to do this as like a side hustle and a hobby, and get bigger cards by trading up into them and selling and flipping into them until they're, so I know people who have very large salaries who I do, consultations with, who they're basically just like, I have 100,000 to buy, this is what I'm thinking. Let's talk about how to spend it. Right. You have those people. And when you're making that type of money and you have that much money, I don't think what they're doing is stupid at all, to be honest with you. I think that they're having fun and they're enjoying it and they can afford it and they understand the risks, blah, blah, blah. But someone who doesn't have the money and is leveraging their cards to take loans, to make those types of purchases, is a completely different financial situation. And I think what they're doing is absolutely terrible and crazy. So wherever you're at, it's just about making smart decisions for your own wallet and your own personal situation. And then also, like, what's the real goal here? The goal is not, having a ton of money and being able to have like all the cards you want. Like, of course, there's can be some pleasure in that and some ease and enjoyment in that, but like it can also be very satisfying to, start more modestly and then kind of work your way up and try to, focus on yourself, try not to compare yourself to other people so much, or where other people are at in their journey, and really kind of, try to be present with sort of your own experience, your own sort of, gradual growth, take satisfaction from sort of where you're at, where you're trying to go to, and just sort of have fun with it. Cause you can definitely, like, if any person is playing the comparison game with other people, that can go, that can be very demotivating. And not very helpful, instead of trying to focus on like what's fun for you and what drives you, in the hobby.
Right. And, I mean, there are, the goals that I have in collecting, they're not going to take my whole life, to get. So once those goals are met, once I get my VS series booster box, among other things, like, then it's like, and that's like, I think, on eBay, that's like 25 grand at the moment. So it's like, once I get that, then it's like, well, what do? Do you consider keep like going up? You know what I mean? And like, now you're looking for the $50,000 booster box, or is it, are you, satisfied for life and all that? So I think, yeah, like that part, I guess that part alone almost kind of makes the speculation a bit silly, because it's like ultimately there is a ceiling on the value of the, like, you know what I mean? It's like you can't just keep trading up forever. You have to have a goal in your collection that you want to satisfy, because otherwise you'll just keep, you know what I mean? There's like a, a natural ceiling that you'll hit at some point if your only goal is to keep making money. So yeah, and I mean, I do think that in Pokemon we are very it's really great that most people actually really love Pokemon. So, there are flippers, there are scalpers for sure, but generally speaking, I think most people love Pokemon. Most people, like myself, just wish we had like tons of money to get the artwork that we wanted, and stuff like that. So, yeah, all I think fairly optimistic for the future, and it's really interesting. Now, one concept I kind of think would be interesting to touch on is like in BSV, Bitcoin SV, we have this idea. By the way, I'm sure you've heard of Bitcoin. Uh, I just want to say that BSV is not BTC. It's not the the Bitcoin that went to 70K and all that. BSV is Bitcoin. It's a whole deal. We don't need to get into it now. But in BSV, just because this is somewhat irrelevant for BTC, but very relevant in BSV, which is that the economy of BSV, like all the BSV holders in the whole world, when one of them creates value, everybody in the ecosystem benefits from it, right? So if somebody earns 1 million BSVs, which is a huge amount, that's like 10% of the entire economy or 5% of the entire economy, that actually makes everybody's Bitcoins more valuable, right? Do you think that in something like collectibles or Pokemon, there's a similar kind of cascading effect? Like when Logan Paul bought the Charizard, did he buy a Charizard or he bought the box? I don't remember. But like, let's say Logan Paul or somebody like that spends $1 million on like a first edition base set Charizard. Does that have this cascading effect where every tier below it in the hobby goes up a little bit? You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for sure, there's I mean, these things I think are possible to measure exactly, but I think naturally people think in relative terms a lot, and so when someone tries to figure out like what should this item be worth, they're comparing it to this other item and this other item and this other item that are fairly similar. And so if a key item in the hobby, like the first edition Charizard from base set, goes up a lot in value, it's natural for a lot of people to say, huh, maybe the other first edition card should from base set should go up. And then maybe someone thinks, well, maybe some of the other WotC ones. And then maybe someone thinks, well, these WotC ones are now more expensive. Why not the middle generation stuff? And then maybe someone thinks, well, if that stuff's more expensive, why not the more modern stuff, or whatever.
Yeah.
Or people think that person paid a really crazy high price. We don't agree with that. And then it's sort of a one-off sale. At a very high price, and people are sort of like, they can do what they want, but we don't agree with that. And if the vast majority of people, or pretty much everyone, feels that way, you could see a very high outside sale over here that doesn't move the market. That doesn't move the market. Yeah.
It is it's a weird kind of like through line, I think, in Pokemon, right? Because it's the type of thing where it's like, because the hobby's so huge and there's so many areas that it's like there's also this kind of information information like gap on what goes up, right? So it's like, okay, somebody sells $1 million Charizard, well, now, okay, every card in base set goes up, but like, how does that translate to like WotC promos, and then does that translate to Japanese theme decks? There's just so many. There's like this circuitous path that where the value travels, and yeah, I think that makes it really fascinating. Like, and also I'm really grateful that there are just so many areas of the hobby. you know,
Mhm.
because you could really find. I mean, people surprise me all the time, like with what uh, with what they like are choosing to focus on. And I appreciate Squeaks being in the chat. Are we comparing Bitcoin SV to Pokemon? I'll just say this right now. No, we are not, but it's very it is actually, there are some parallels because I like the idea that Pokemon is a little economy. You know what I mean? I still believe in the idea of trading the cards. You can trade Squirtle for 3 Weedles, you know? That little barter economy within Pokemon is very similar to how Bitcoin works, where it's also this little hyper connected network. But they have such a different, they have such a different, all right, I'll just give 1 second of context, which is that the entire crypto world hates BSV, which is why it's really interesting when you talk about it sort of somewhat outside of the BSV world. BSV gets a lot of hate, but Squeaks, we're definitely gonna have to get you on, and we'll have like a straight up conversation on it. But for the moment, yeah, just the idea that of like a sort of self-contained economy. Of course, Pokemon both of these require like fiat inflow currently, but like, you know, they have this sort of self-contained nature. I mean, what's crazy is that you could conceivably have, like, if the Pokemon ended today, every card could just be traded for every other card, you know, which I think is like something that makes it really fascinating.
Well, I think that the human psychology is the same in all these markets. It's just the things that we're trading or selling or speculating, investing or collecting or whatever are different and have different fundamentals and have different value principles, to go back where we sort of started the conversation. I mean, when an altcoin, when Dogecoin goes up a huge amount in value, the next day you have lots of people thinking, okay, what's the next one going to be? You have lots of
Yeah.
people thinking, like, what about Dogecoin made it go up a lot? Oh, it's a meme type of thing. Okay, what other like funny meme coins could we do? And then, oh, what happened and how did it explode? Well, it exploded because big influencers or like Elon Musk talked about it, and then that helped it even more. So like, how do we get Elon Musk to talk about our token or like tweet about,
Right.
it's like, that's how there's a lot of that in Pokemon, right? There's a lot of that in cards where it was like, okay, this thing went up. How do we make this other thing go up? Or why did this one go up? And everyone's trying to be there first often, or slightly before the sort of the next thing blows up. And it's, it, you have to be careful with all that stuff because it really removes you from the actual, uh, if you're very focused on the process and all of sort of the psychology around why something in the moment becomes valuable, particularly if that value is more based on like greed or like attention or like trying to be part of like an in crowd versus the actual thing provides me joy regardless of its value or regardless of what other people think about it. Like that's
Yeah.
how bubbles are formed. That's how momentary quick bubbles are formed. And like it
Yeah.
feels like every day there's a new bubble in crypto around a new around a new coin, or around a
Well, we can
new.
talk about crypto because, you know, I'm of the opinion that it's basically all fake. Like all the there's not a single good cryptocurrency, and I'm not even gonna try to evangelize BSV, but they're all fake, and they're all basically arbitrage opportunities, you know, um, using stable coins like Tether and stuff, and like, oh, my Doge went up, so now I'm gonna put the Doge into the BTC, and then the BTC goes up, and I put it back into the Doge, and I just play this shuffle game, and you know, I end up with a lot of money that eventually that you really cannot, especially as time goes on, it will be a lot harder to turn back into liquid cash. You know, so um, most people keep their crypto billions, in stable coins, which are not liquid cash, So
I think doing that type of day trading is generally works very badly for people in most
yeah,
things. I think that certainly the bigger the fees are, the worse you're going to do. So for something like stocks, there are some decent fees, but in Pokemon, the fees are terrible. For example, like eBay,
Mm,
you're paying eBay fees, you're paying auction, house fees, you're paying all these fees every time you flip something or sell something or move something, unless you're selling directly to someone. That generally the arbitrage you want to do, and I think this is true for crypto too, and I think a lot of people who made a lot of money doing arbitrage in crypto were actually taking advantage of the fact that, like, maybe in Japan this they could sell this coin for much higher than they bought it for in the US for whatever reason, or
for
taking
sure.
advantage
Yeah.
of, but they were actually taking advantage of this. They were buying a coin at one price and then selling it, that exact coin, at a higher price on a different market. And the same thing happens in Pokemon, right? Now, because whereas because things are so much more optimized in the stock market, that type of opportunity does not exist the same way to the same extent as it does in Pokemon, or I would say digital currency. Although I know the digital currency landscape is like very different now than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It's like a rapidly changing environment. I know, like, Sam Bankman-Fried, right? I mean, that's how he started making a lot of money in crypto, was literally doing what I just talked about, just straight up arbitrage of the same coins, making like,
Oh yeah. Well, I think that's that's where the like the valuations of all of these coins is all that. It's like a house of cards. I mean, if every single person who owns BTC tried to cash it out, there would be no BTC, or there would be no dollars, or the price would go to zero. So
yeah,
they're,
and
yeah,
think
they're
I think
illiquid.
yes, and I think that that's true for all, for most. I mean, it's the same with cards. Like, if every person who owned a card listed the card at the same time, for I don't think that there are enough people out there who could buy every single. I mean, it depends on the card, right? I mean, the obviously very rare cards that maybe aren't that expensive, like, wouldn't affect the market so negatively, but the the rarer the more that can actually flood the market at once, et cetera. But yes, I mean, there's a lot of danger. But how do you think banks work, right? I mean, like singular banks can't cover.
Uh-oh.
Ooh, can you hear me again?
Got you now. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, banks, right? Uh, when there are runs historically on banks, and then they don't have the money because banks fundamentally are taking money, paying you some sort of interest, some sort of, 2, 3, 4, 1, whatever percent, interest rate, and then they're taking
Well,
that money.
that's what happened to FTX, right?
Exactly, and
Yeah.
investing it and loaning it, and then making more money on it, by loaning it back to people at 13% or 20% or whatever, or investing it in projects and trying to make more on it, and that creates a very dangerous. That's why greed systems, and it almost collapsed the entire housing market in 2008,
Yeah.
and the economic. I mean, these types of, like, house of cards, betting on bets, and that's why there's, like, a push for regulation. And what does regulation actually mean? Like, I don't know. And who's doing the regulating? Like,
Yeah.
those are important questions. And how do we regulate the regulators, and all these types of things? But it's when there's a lot of gambling on gambling, and then people are sort of willing to take part in that gambling, and then put their entire, you know, savings into something like that, and they don't really fundamentally understand exactly the risk. It is a tragedy, and obviously people get affected by those types of things all the time. And people here, I think that, like, investing is like how you become rich, and investing is the way to get out of your terrible job, and investing to basically make that passive income. The sayings that your guru will tell you is something like, you'll never, like, the amount of money you can make per hour is limited to your skill set, but the amount of money you can make in like an investment in an investment is like endless opportunity, and it takes no more of your time, because the more money you
Right.
put in, the more you make, and it takes the exact same amount of time, but you make more because you're putting in more money. And that is fundamentally true. But that sort of story, I think people don't realize like the risk and like the patience I think you need, and the temperament, because I think investing is fundamentally about temperament and being able to weather sort of and not be um, um, pushed into basically either fear or greed, too strongly in either
Yeah.
direction. And I think often, you're just, and I'm a value investor fundamentally, but you're just going back to like, what is value? What is value? What is value? Does this have value? How am I measuring value? And do I think other people are correctly measuring this? Do I think the market is correctly measuring it? Or do I think the market has it wrong? And then trying to sort of take advantage of that one way or another, either buying or selling. But I think that a lot of people aren't that interested in investing,
Mm.
like, and they don't have a passion for investing like maybe I do. And so they're not going to be that successful at it. And because they're not actually interested in having those discussions and in searching for value, they're just
Yeah.
interested in like quitting their job. And
Right.
that I
Well, and I think we live in a time where like what have the meme stocks and the meme coins taught us? I think
Yeah.
they've taught people that there is no reason to hold on to cash. You don't want to hold on to cash. You want to park it in something, because even if you bought 100 meme coins, one of them is going to go up, 1,000 times or whatever. Um, and you'll win. So I think I mean, it's a failure in many directions. And yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it really is what's at the root is that people don't, um, like we basically as a society don't have a strong money. I don't want to like put like a ideological thing behind it, but like we just don't have a strong money. So you have to put your cash into something, if you want to like grow it or beat inflation or whatever. And like it's becoming increasingly more necessary for average people to actually to do that, because if they don't, their income will never, go beyond a very narrow, where the middle class median average is. And I think that is uh, it's dangerous, and it's the mindset that I believe pushed something like the Pokemon boom, right? Because that's where and that's why Pokemon is so fascinating in that way, because it's like Dogecoin. It's very kind of easy to see because it's such a like, let's pretend that it is what it says it is. It appears to be such a liquid asset where you could like buy and sell it a million times a day. It's very easy to kind of trace like cause and effect within something like that. But then you look at the Pokemon hobby, and it was like this long arc of a boom, that we're still in. And I don't know, it's really interesting, like, because yeah, I just feel like people don't have any reason to like have faith in cash, right? Um, and as a result, they're always just looking for something to put it in, that's going to grow.
Well, I mean, another thing you can do, right, is like develop your career or skill sets that are of value to people, so that
Right.
no matter what happens in the economy with inflation, like, yes, if you're sitting on a pile of cash and you make very little money, and your cash is, constantly becoming less valuable because of inflation. And like, again, I think the inflation drum of like how inflation is going to like crush you. And like, I mean, there are plenty of times where like sitting on a lot of cash was the right decision, because all markets during that period went down 30% and
Mm.
your cash went down 2% or something,
Sure.
whatever,
Yeah.
but I think that to the point I was talking about before, like if you like finding something you really enjoy doing and is like helpful and useful to other people and people really appreciate and enjoy and adds value to other people's lives is a great hedge against like being poor or being broke,
Yeah.
because you have a skill set and you are a person who can do something that's going to add value to other people that people will pay you for, and people will always pay you for those types of things.
Right.
And so I think that for sure, then taking the money that you make in that and like learning how to invest if you have a passion for it, or finding a financial advisor and or, is often a really important thing. But I do think a lot of people now are super burned out from their jobs. They were at home all the time, and so there were a lot of people who got into day trading and all sorts of things. So I'm not sure are passionate or fundamentally like good investors or have the discipline or the mindset of being a good long-term investor, and
Yeah.
more just like wanted to escape their day job and had a lot of time on their hands, or like couldn't go into work or fire or whatever. And I think that has caused some of the booms and collapses we have seen.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I mean, I think it's also just like the tools are now available to do that. 20
yeah,
years ago, you had to buy a stock out of a book, and now you can buy fractional shares on your phone.
sure. And
Um,
that's both good and bad, because it's good because it makes it much more accessible and easier, but it's also bad because people who it's very like easy to do now. And so if you're
yeah,
not you have no business doing it, you can very easily do it.
yeah. I
But
mean, when you democratize finance, you end up, I think, with potentially greater inequality. Or at least I think that's what's playing out. Um, but it
and
is the way of things.
why do you think that is? That as they've democratized it, it's expanded inequality. I'm interested in sort of where your thought process was there.
I feel like it well it turns it into a game. Um, it sort of makes it like, let's say, like before something like Robinhood, you had to open a brokerage account, with your bank, um,
Mm,
to purchase Apple stock or something, right? There was a process, there was like a formalism to it that sort of invited you to think very carefully about what you're doing. And you also probably had to speak to somebody to even make it happen, right?
mm,
Now, with something like Robinhood, yes, okay, like someone like my dad, who's a very smart guy and knows how to do it, it's great for him, right? But for a ton of people my age, you're probably like, that's like your first dollar you're ever going to invest is going to be through Robinhood. And like, what does it take? You just download it on your phone, do a KYC, and that's it. You can now spend your money on whatever, this and that. I don't think there's too much like barrier to like get you margin trading, all that sort of stuff. So and I'm not necessarily saying it's all bad, right?
yeah,
It's not necessarily bad, but I do think that the sort of ripple effect of it is, one, because of the failure of like the wider economic system to kind of make people feel uh, like, to make people trust in the system. Let's put it that way, right?
mm,
Because of that, it's like pushed people more towards these things. And then on the other side, you get that sort of like gamified interface, this sort of gameable element to it where it like feels like you're getting a high score or whatever. Again, not necessarily a bad thing inherently, but I think that's why you get these. You're getting these boom and bust cycles happening much faster, right?
I think the danger is when businesses like Robinhood for stocks, or like eBay or auction houses for Pokemon or PSA or whatever,
Mhm.
is targeting people and encouraging people who have no business or no knowledge or no experience, and making it seem like we're your friend, and if you do this, like, you can be rich, or like you'll make a lot of money, And I think that, Robinhood coming out with commercials are talking about how like we're sort of the savior of the financial space because like we're giving the little guys like a chance to fight and like be
Right.
involved. And like,
Which, by the way, that's also, I just want to say, that's like the narrative of all the crypto exchanges. That's like also
and
the narrative they
and
operate on.
some of that is true, right? And it is important for people who it's important to make these things accessible to some degree. But the unintended consequence, or in some cases, I think the intended consequence, is that the people actually getting rich are Robinhood or the fund or it's the ones taking the fees for more trading activity or for
Right.
memberships or however these things are run. And and in the meantime, it's sort of like a casino. They're operating a casino, and the fish, it's like bringing a bunch of fish and uneducated investors into the space and people who don't really know what they're doing. And those people basically their money gets taken by the top 1% of the people who are like the most skilled and the most engaged and really know what they're doing. And in the meantime, the people doing the advertising and bringing more of those people into the space are the auction house or the this or the that. And that's a very cynical take of what's going on. I think some of that's happening. I also think though there are people who are very interested in investing or have maybe somewhat of a gift for it or somewhat of a knack for it. And these types of platforms and platforms like eBay or auction houses has given them an ability to actually start a business and to do this now and be effective, which is awesome. So it's not, and so there like might be people out here listening, like just because you're new at something does not mean that you can't be very good at it. And doesn't mean that now that you have access to it, that could be a really great thing. But I think the danger is that when depression's at a high rate, anxiety is at a high rate, and and people really hate their jobs, and we've been through this pandemic. Like, there's a lot of like psychological, I think, risk factors and trauma factors that are then combined with like companies potentially targeting and taking advantage of people to get fees with the and putting it through the lens of like we're your friends instead of like the honest truth, which is just like we just want more people to sign up for our thing and to trade on our platform, because the more people trade and the more people put money in, the more money we make. It's tricky because it's
Well, and I like maybe you can give some insight because like PWCC. So I've never really used it. That is an auction house that probably what started with sports cards or even earlier collectibles.
all cards. Yeah.
All cards. When did they start selling Pokemon cards?
That I do not know. For a long time, for like well before the boom, for sure.
Okay.
But they used to be on eBay and have a relationship with eBay. Now they have their own platform.
Right. They got like kicked off eBay, right?
Yeah, a few months before they were gonna leave anyway. Supposedly.
Yeah. Yeah. There's another thing, just like I read like a tweet on when it comes to like digital money. It's like, yeah, if I spend $50 in cash, that person spends $50 at the next place. Person spends $50 again. You know what I mean? There's this long line, and the $50 remains $50. But if I buy $50 worth of something with a credit card, that person's going to get $46, and then they're going to go spend $42 at another business, and so on and so forth. And after like 6 degrees of swiping credit cards, that money is all gone. The $50 is basically evaporated into fees. And I think that is kind of like the structural thing that a lot of these companies like Robinhood and all that are basically taking advantage of.
And what do casinos do? Casinos do the exact same thing. They give free drinks, free money to get you in, to suck you in. And then when you start doing it and you start engaged in it, then they make, way more off of you, basically. So listen, you just have to be aware of, I think, these types of things and very honest with yourself. Now, there's also the argument that these businesses would not exist if they weren't providing a good service that's actually useful and helping people. So there's more of a sort of conservative, and I politically, I'm a very moderate person, and I actually think that this sort of conservative view of the world makes a lot of sense, and I actually think the liberal view of the world makes a lot of sense. And I think part of what's so difficult is that both things make sense, and they're both two different lenses to view a lot of these issues.
For
And
sure.
both make a point, but both don't really have the whole story in my view. Because
Yeah. I mean, sorry, go on.
well, I was going to say, it is true that fundamentally, usually scams or things that are really taking advantage of people, they do not last unless they have such a monopoly or a stranglehold on something, or they have so much power, or they threaten violence against people or community. And violence can be like physical violence or like emotional violence or using the law or whatever. So generally,
economic violence,
exactly.
really.
Yeah. Economic violence. Absolutely. So generally speaking, right, if, in most cases, most companies provide a decent service and a good enough service to stay in business and are useful enough generally, or they're extremely corrupt and they are like basically violently keeping their customers there for a variety of like psychological reasons when it's actually bad for them. And we can find examples of companies that have done that. But in the US, hopefully, the idea of having a mixed economy where government gets involved is like there are some laws, there are some things that we don't allow businesses to do because it's predatory, because it brings out the worst, it takes advantage of the most vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it's an interesting spectrum, and I tend to think that if we talked about like eBay as a company, or we talked about like some of these crypto exchanges, like we could rate them on like how well we think they treat their customers and how predatory do we think they are versus like running really win-win businesses. But sorry, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. I do think it's interesting that even within eBay, right, as a platform, there is a sort of free market happening on eBay, and certain sellers will rise to the top, like, going like within Pokemon, the person who sells like the cheapest, largest volume of booster boxes will sort of always, end up at the top of the search if we're going to use that as like, the who's winning in that economy type thing. So that's, to me, consumer friendly. I'm a free market kind of guy. But then like everybody using eBay and paying eBay massive fees. And I don't know, I'm trying to think of like, because I'm sure eBay's done some policy changes, in response to the boom and stuff. Like, didn't they start up like a trading card vault or something? I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Not really too privy to all this stuff. I kind of rarely buy off eBay these days. But yeah, I mean, the thing is that everybody's out to nickel and dime you, and they can, and there's an incentive to, in the same way that like you're, you know, losing out, like you feel the need to like make up your 8% inflation. So these companies feel the need to like make up, that 8% fees and stuff, So I can't really blame them. But it is like a hidden part of, I think, where we are in all these things. So yeah, awareness is key for sure. And you'd like to what you'd like to see as an idealist is that, well, so like if I buy, because if I'm going to buy Pokemon, the best way I think is either, at a game store or like from somebody, you know what I mean? Like somebody who held this box for the last 6 months. I'm not going to pay you cash and get that box, and like they're in that sort of interaction, the the fee, so to speak, is like comes in the sort of intangibleness of the transaction itself, you know, like the fact that you were holding something for 6 months and now you've unloaded it potentially for a profit. That's where your fee comes in. You know what I mean? That's where like that's, you know what I mean? Like, I know it's a bit abstract, but there's such a, there's so much, there's a kind of beauty and elegance to like the locality of it when like you can just get something from somebody in this peer-to-peer kind of fashion. And anytime there's like a third party involved, there's always some loss, some friction happening somewhere, you know. And but without those third parties, would we still like boom and grow the hobby, you know, as we've seen? So it's a tough call. It's tough to see. You'd like to see those third parties kind of refine and get more consumer friendly over time, you know. Um, but will they? Right? And you can see it like I'm sure eBay, probably the fees on eBay are much higher than they were 10, 20 years ago, right? So I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, it's why there's so much complaining, right? I mean, part of why there's so much complaining online and complaining in general is part of the reason people are complaining is they're trying to get companies to do things that are more in their interest. So if you and I sit here and we complain about eBay, maybe eBay will hear that. Maybe other people will hear that and stop shopping on eBay. Maybe, and obviously the bigger the platform, the more that people listen to it, the more effect that can have. And I think that that's part of where that comes from,
Well, my feeling is that like I don't want to be pessimistic, but I don't think the complaining can really do anything. You know what I mean? You'd have to either take action or, even better, beat them in the free market. You know, like take their sales away, give somebody a bigger and better platform.
I think that the free market of ideas, which is, if we want to keep using the word free market, I think complaining can maybe have a negative connotation or get a bad rap, but complaining about something can be very powerful actually. And making a complaint known to a wide group of people who feel the same way can lead to quite a bit, I think, of action, both in more people talking about it, more people making videos, but also people stop shopping there, stop using it.
Yeah.
Which can eventually hurt them financially, which, if your argument is that they don't really care about complaints as long as it doesn't hurt their bottom line, I agree with that. But I think that the perception of these companies and the brand, the sort of brand perception can be damaged by people's opinions and by people's general emotions towards companies. And so I think companies, depending on the company and depending on the situation, and depending, again, there's a lot of factors, right? The more of a monopoly that a company has, the less at risk, the more of a moat, if we want to use, financial, value investment type terms, the more of a moat a company has, and what a moat is, for viewers, is a competitive advantage. Okay. So the more of a competitive advantage a company has over other companies around it, the worse it can treat its customers fundamentally, the less it has to cater to them because they provide such a much better service than the other companies around it, that you'll keep coming back to them even if you hate them. PSA can be a great example of this, right? Like there's a ton of people who hate PSA. They think it's a bunch of nonsense. They don't, whatever, but they still agree with PSA because PSA makes them the most money on the secondary market. And at the end of the day, they're willing to pay PSA a premium, because they'll make more money on the secondary market because of it. But if that stops being the case, then maybe the complaining and the negativity, PSA would have to take it more seriously and there have to be more action around it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I also think that there are human beings working at these companies. And I think that sometimes people underestimate that, yes, these companies are supposed to be all profit driven fundamentally. And companies we only care about profit and we have to do it for our shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. But in the reality, people want to be liked. And there are people at these companies, and now some people more than others, who I think do want to be liked and want to feel comfortable. And there is a certain value in not being hated and people appreciating you and enjoying your service and enjoying your company that is not
Right.
always measured in dollars and cents. And so I do think that companies at times, I'm sure, give up some profitability to not have to deal with all of the negativity and the hassle in some cases, even though fundamentally maybe they're not supposed to, because companies are not people and companies are just supposed to be profit driven or whatever. You
Well,
know,
it's a tug of war for sure.
yeah,
Okay, well, so all right, to close this out, I just want to ask, uh, can you give? Because yeah, so we saw a lot of complaining, rightfully so. You know, in like 2020, 2021, a lot of scalping happening from third party sellers, even retail sellers like my local Barnes and Nobles marks everything up like a good 15% and stuff. And so there were a lot of people were rightfully angry and frustrated and all that. So it, did you see anything come out of that complaining? Like, do you think something positive came out of that? Because there's a lot of discussion about it. Like, is this valid? Is it do people have the right to even complain about this? Do people have the right to scalp? This sort of thing. But there was a lot of talk, a lot of discussion, and so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on whether that was like a good thing and like led to some positive change that you can tell as somebody who's really close with the hobby. And before you go, I want to make sure to get your favorite set and your favorite card.
sure. Sorry. So your question is just like, what do I think the complaining about the high prices was good or bad?
Yeah, well, because we talked about you said that complaining can have a positive effect, and I'm curious if you
Sure.
can speak on whether you saw a positive.
Or a desired effect from the person complaining, because sometimes there's usually multiple people involved in a complaint. And usually the person complaining is trying to get the other person to change, and the other person who is hearing the complaint does not want to change. So it's not always positive for the person who has to deal with and hear the complaining. But so do I think that, sorry, the complaining about the scalping specifically, or just high prices from the company? Because I think there's a lot there. First, like, are we talking about like the Frosted Caribou era in Pokemon and like?
Oh, sure, yeah. That's a good.
Are we
Yeah, like
talking
her video is probably like the.
because like I think people were pointing the fingers at a lot of different people, and there was complaining in a lot of different directions.
Mm.
And do I think that stuff was good for the hobby? I think it was fine. Like I don't. I think there's also just like the issue with like complaining into the void with no solutions, or not really at anyone specifically, particularly if it's not specifically at someone who can change. I'm not saying Frosted Caribou is complaining into the void, but I think there was a decent amount of just complaining into the void. Like, I don't like this and I don't know whose fault it is. That's
Yeah.
more just venting. And that's like, I think fine, because it can make someone feel better or it can make someone feel worse or some combination. But if you're complaining, or, directly to someone, or saying, you go, let's throw Mason under the bus here. So, like Mason is selling, Cardinal Gaming is selling, runs an LGS local game store, and he's selling things at $150. Okay. And now you go on his reviews online, and you go on, and this booster box used to sell for 90, or on, let's say on eBay right now it sells for 110, but he's selling it for 150. And you go and you complain to him and you say, you're a scalper, you're a terrible person. Like, he got a lot of this, right?
Yeah.
During the boom. Do I think that specifically with Mason had a positive impact? No. I mean, Mason didn't lower his prices. There were enough people who were willing to buy at 150 that I just think he was like, this is just the market price. This is where we're able to sell it at. And like, we're going to sell it at what the market is selling it at. We're not lying to people. We're not cheating people. We're not taking advantage of people. And, if you go, I was talking about this last night on someone's channel. If you go to a convention and you sell a card for $5,000, but someone could buy that exact same card for $3,000 on eBay, but they didn't do the work to figure out that you could, like, are you a bad person for doing that? And, or is that ethically or not, okay. I would not do that. I would never do that. I would never try to cheat someone out of $2,000. I would literally tell them, you can get this card on eBay. You shouldn't buy it from me. And I've done that like many times at shows. I've talked people out of buying cards from me, buying packs, this or that. But I also think like, if you would be someone who would do that, like there are pros and cons in that. And, you know, and people have different worldviews, and you have to respect that some people's worldviews are like, it's always on the consumer. And and we're in a game here, and you and I are on equal footing. And if I'm able to like sell something for a higher amount, I should be able to, you know, and that's perfectly fine. But I guess
Right.
going back to your question about like, does the complaining do something, or did it do something then? I don't know. There might be. I think when you look at like Danny Phantom, it definitely affected him.
Mm.
I think that Danny did a lot of like bringing down prices for people, giving away boxes. Like I think he's someone who was very responsive to the outrage and frustration of like higher prices. And do I think there were probably lots of local game stores that if you went to your local game store and you were a loyal customer and you said like, this is upsetting, like blah, 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 like they may have lowered their price a bit, and then others that wouldn't, you know?
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
Yeah. And ultimately, like, the sad thing about that is that the local game store is really not who, you know, you'd necessarily want to be, you know, selling at the lowest, right? They're the ones that kind of have the most risk in all this,
Yeah,
right?
you know, unfortunately, and I think it's a struggle for the business model, is that a lot of them have to sell at that high because they own a physical store, and it's expensive to run a physical store, and they have employees, and they have to make like 30-40% margin on a lot of things.
Yeah.
To pay themselves $60,000 a year, $70,000 a year, and just like live like a solid middle class lifestyle.
Right. Right. And trading card, there's, I mean, very few stores that sell only trading cards. You know what I mean? I'm sure for any store that sells trading cards, that's like a pretty small part of their entire business and all that.
Yeah.
Okay, Jake, man, thanks so much for coming on here. This is my first foray into poke tubing. Hopefully much more. I'm definitely going to like just talk, because Pokemon is, you know, it's the greatest thing in the world to talk about. And so, yeah, thank you so much for coming in here. Rapid fire.
Okay.
Top 3 sets and favorite card.
Top 3 sets. Let's go Versus Series. Let's go Team Rocket Returns. And let's go. How about Plasma Storm?
Wow, that's a very tasteful selection. Very tasteful.
And what was your other question?
Favorite card, if you had to pick one.
Favorite card. If I just had to pick one, I guess I would just go for Alakazam base set, maybe.
Also very tasteful.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. And base set is probably my
favorite card.
To be honest, base set's probably my favorite set. But
yeah, I hear you. Because of the memories, you'd say.
Yeah, it started it all. It's the greatest set of all time by far. It's not even close when it really comes down to it. But like the cool, like Versus Series, like now is more exciting and interesting because there's a million like cards with amazing art, and like, you know, there's a lot more variety than base set. But
I love Versus Series. That's like the dream set to me. Do you own the full set?
Yeah.
Amazing. That's why we get Jake on. Everybody definitely check out Jake's channel. Jake is like he's like the Pokemon Rudy. Rudy is like the Magic Jake. We hopefully can have Jake on in the future. He's also got a Patreon, which I will definitely join at some point when I'm like more serious about Pokemon fully.
No pressure, absolutely no pressure.
Yeah. No, I'm very selective with my Patreons, and that's definitely, you know, top of the list. So,
I think too, it's one of those things that like financially too, like you know, if you want to put that 10 extra dollars into Pokemon or like do, you know, like Dan and I, we make a lot of free content. And so I think it's like totally reasonable to just, there's plenty of good free content.
Yeah.
It's not like they're starving for free content, you know,
Yeah.
out there. So, and a lot of it is and a lot of other, not just Dan and I, but a lot of other content creators too.
For sure.
So, you know, but I think, yeah, for people who want that extra sort of thing, the Discord community is a really nice community, a lot of knowledge in there. And for some people, $10 a month is like nothing compared to what they spend on Pokemon. And then so it's easily worth it. And then for other people, it's like that $10 a month is like, you know, is more, you know, considerable. So that's what I would say. I don't want anyone, this is not directed at you specifically, but I would not want anyone like joining the Patreon and it being like a burden, like a financial burden in any way.
Yeah. You know, which is definitely the right attitude. I mean, we not to keep you too much longer, but I'm really fascinated by Patreon because it's my belief that Patreon is today and like the mainstream, the biggest example of what the future of like a creator audience economy is going to look like for artists and influencers of all kinds. Like the idea of just paying directly to the person that you really like what they're doing. So, so for that reason, you know, it does make sense. And it is really great.
I support people on Patreon. It's a great way to encourage them to like that and tell them like, I like what you're doing and I really appreciate it and I want you to keep doing it. And I do think that like, that's why I am signed up for the people that I'm signed up, you know, with, because I appreciate them for sure.
All right. Awesome, man. Well, again, thank you so much for doing this. I really hope we can have some more discussions in the future when there's when the time is right, because you know, can definitely talk Pokemon all day. So yeah, thank you so much. Really, really great to have you.
You're welcome. Happy to be on. Go subscribe to this channel.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah. Good night, everybody.
Help him out. Yeah.